Syracuse is New York's fourth largest city, reporting a total population of over 145,000 people in 2010. As with any large city, Syracuse has its dangerous areas that are riddled with crime, primarily due to gangs. Recorded history traces early Syracuse gangs all the way back to the 1960s. Like many street gangs, Syracuse gangs started off being very loosely organized. However, after the crack epidemic of the 1980s, Syracuse gangs started to become more organized in order to capitalize on this new drug market. The first gang we'll be discussing are the Almighty Latin Kings and Queens Nation. The Latin Kings' presence can be found in Syracuse all the way back to the 1980s. The Latin Kings differ from most street gangs regarding their presentation. The Latin Kings try to emphasize that they are there for their community and try to act as a family for those who feel lost or isolated. It was estimated in 1996 that the Latin Kings' total membership in Syracuse made up of 100 local boys and men. Though the Latin Kings claim to not endorse violence, law officials would disagree. In the summer of 1996, police reports linked 3 different shootings to the Latin Kings. However, though they claim to have linked these shootings to the Latin Kings, no murders themselves were able to be linked to the Latin Kings within that same year. The year afterward, in 1997, saw a great increase in gang activity throughout the city. 2 of the most prominent gangs in this year were the 110 gang, as well as their rivals, Boot Camp. Common rivalry disputes between these 2 gangs have revolved around several reasons, including turf, women, and glares of disrespect. Such disputes have led to countless murders between the 2 gangs, including countless revenge shootings. The origins of Boot Camp stemmed from the merge of 2 former rival gangs. The first of these 2 rival gangs were the Fernwood Boot Camp, formed in 1994 by Tyree Allen. The goal of this gang was simply to make a profit selling drugs. Tyree would supply his members with crack to sell on the streets, with Tyree receiving the money, then cutting a portion of the profits to his members. In 1995, the Fernwood Boot Camp would be challenged by a group of young delinquents, seeking revenge for being denied entry into the gang. This gang would be known as Little Boot Camp, led by Caro Brown, who were known for being notoriously violent. Following a shootout, these 2 gangs would merge into the Boot Camp gang. In June of 1996, Tyree, the founder of the original Fernwood Boot Camp gang, as well as another member of the gang, would tragically die in a car crash. With Caro Brown now being the main leader of Boot Camp, Caro would now take the direction of Boot Camp to be notoriously violent, waging constant wars on rival gangs who were selling drugs on the south side of Syracuse. Caro was now leading the Boot Camp gang with the combined directions of both the previous Little Boot Camp gang he directed, as well as the direction of Tyree Allen, who was more focused on drug control. For the following years, gang activity would continue to cripple down Syracuse. After hitting an all-time homicide rate in 2002, Syracuse police knew they needed to hammer down on this ongoing gang issue, particularly targeting Boot Camp members, as well as another gang known as Elk Block. From April 29, 2002 to April 15, 2003, the new Syracuse Police Department's full-time gang task force had filed over 10,000 charges against a total of over 5,000 people. Although these are prominent figures, many residents of Syracuse were still not satisfied. The main problem with these figures was that most of the arrests made were for minor infractions, rather than felony violations. Such felony violations include high-level crimes such as grand larceny, weapons, and attempted murder. In other words, although people were getting arrested often, the most dangerous of criminals were still roaming the streets. Residents of Syracuse also questioned how their police department allowed such a problem to get out of hand to begin with, often accusing the department of gang denial. Despite these criticisms, the department continued to make further advancements, including major ones in the second half of 2003. On August 8th of 2003, 2 members of the Boot Camp gang were indicted by a federal grand jury of violating the RICO Act by using their membership status to engage in drug possession and murder. A member of another Syracuse gang called Elk Block, named Demetrius Elmore, had been shot and killed in a drive-by shooting by the boot camp gang members Leonard Holbdy and Christian Williams. The reason behind the shooting was due to turf dispute, where Demetrius had been shot riding a bicycle to see his grandmother, who resided in boot camp turf. Nearly a year later, on June 28, 2004, Williams would plead guilty to Demetrius's murder. A month prior, 26 other boot camp members would also be indicted on RICO charges for their usage of violence and drug trade to control their turf. Most notably, among these 26 members would be Caro Brown himself. By August 2004, 24 boot camp members arrested under RICO had pleaded guilty, with an additional member having their charges dropped before trial. On August 3rd of 2004, a federal court jury found Caro guilty of racketeering charges and that he was responsible for at least 2 murders or attempted murders. Boot camp had progressed from a gang not considered a threat with low levels of organization, all the way up to a highly structured organization worth being investigated on the federal level. Boot camp serves as a key example as to what can happen when local jurisdictions engage in gang denial, and how big an issue can spiral out of control. The heavy crackdown of the boot camp gang demonstrated much more safety in Syracuse. Early 2004 crime reports indicate general criminal activity had dropped in Syracuse by 14% in the first 6 months, compared to the same time period in 2003. Although a prominent gang had been taken down, there were still further gangs to tackle. The next primary gang federal authorities began to target was now the previously mentioned Elk Block gang. With a former high competitor gang now taken off the streets, Elk Block began to seize control over the drug market within the South Side. Their control would be short-lived, as in July of 2005, 16 prominent members of the gang were indicted on RICO charges. With Elk Block now losing control, unfortunately came another opportunity for a new gang to seize control. The next gang to seize control of Syracuse's streets was the Brighton Brigade. However, their fate would meet the rest of the previous mentioned gangs, as RICO indictments would result in the arrests of 14 members, with all pleading guilty. The next street gang to become the next powerhouse of Syracuse was the previously mentioned 110 gang. As being previously mentioned in this video, this gang did not rise to power out of nowhere. They had been preparing their stride since 1998, with a hierarchical structure dealing drugs. The structure started with 3 dealers who would receive their drug supply. These 3 dealers would transfer the supply to OG gang members, who are known as mid-level dealers. These dealers then supply lower-level members, who would sell 8 balls of cocaine and crack to customers, who were given the nicknames of licks. In 2009, 12 members of 110 would be indicted on RICO violations. The next Syracuse gang to face RICO violations were the Bricktown gang. The previous gangs discussed that were busted by RICO violations all included violence between rival gangs members. However, the violence discussed with Bricktown involves civilian cases. The first case involves we will be discussing is the murder of Rashad Walker Jr., who was tragically only a baby. Rashad was killed by Bricktown member Saquon Evans, who fired a gun into the back of a minivan in revenge for a gang shooting that only occurred 2 days prior. The second innocent victim was Anthony Ford, who was shot and killed on his front porch. Anthony had unfortunately been a victim of mistaken identity for a rival gang member. The Bricktown gang, like all other gangs mentioned in this video, sold drugs in their territory. The gang often scribbled graffiti related to the gang on buildings in their territory. An example of this graffiti is the symbol of 252, which symbolizes the willingness members have to spend 25 years all the way up to life in prison. In 2011, 14 members were arrested for RICO violations, with Bricktown's chief being amongst the arrests. By November 2012, all 14 of these members would be sentenced to federal prison for a range of violations, similar to the previous gangs mentioned. Throughout Syracuse, as you can see, street gangs have and still continue to be a massive contributor to crime. This issue will likely continue to plague Syracuse, as many of the socioeconomic reasons for their existence still continue. However, as you've also seen demonstrated, law enforcement has begun to treat the issue of street gangs with much more seriousness, as well as federal prosecutors now working on prevention methods, attempting to direct potential gang members away from gangs. In September 2012, the U.S. Justice Department gave Syracuse a $300,000 grant, which is one out of 9 grants awarded nationally to fund effort to reduce gang violence, with the grant being used to start a program called Syracuse Truce, with the goal of preventing further street gangs from being formed. Now let's talk about a different set of gangs from a different city in New York, called Rochester. Rochester, with a population of over 200,000, according to the 2010 census data, is the third largest city in New York, with the city also containing the state's highest homicide rate. A specific area of Rochester known as the Crescent makes up around 80% of Rochester's homicide rate, with the Crescent itself making up about 27% of the residency of Rochester. The Crescent is not one individual neighborhood, but rather a mixture of high-crime neighborhoods, together forming a crescent. The most prominent gang in Rochester are known as Dipset. Dipset is a local Rochester gang, with its membership reaching around 80, and most members' ages ranging from 15 to 21. In December of 2003, police arrested 12 members of Dipset. An interesting observation about these arrests was a lack of loyalty between the members, with many members quickly providing information to police in exchange for a reduction in sentencing. The Dipset gang from mid-2002 to 2003 also had been linked to at least 8 homicides. It was also stated that Dipset formed randomly between youths who grew up together, and as they got older, engaged in criminal actions such as drug dealing, robbery, and homicide. Some of their competition include gangs such as Thurston Zoo and Plymouth Rock, all fighting for control of Rochester's drug market. Street gangs have also had a presence in Buffalo, New York. In the 1960s, a gang by the name of Mad Dogs had taken over the majority of East Buffalo. Wearing jackets with Mad Dogs on the back, this gang would also engage in various crimes such as theft and disputes with other gangs over turf. One unique difference to Mad Dogs from most other modern gangs was that their choice of fighting often involved hand-to-hand combat and weapons involving bats, rocks, and switchblades. After roughly a decade, Mad Dogs disbanded, with many members turning to factory jobs for work. In the early 1980s, the next major gang to pick up after Mad Dogs was the FBP. The beginning of FBP started with a young group of boys attending the same local school called Future Academy School No. 37. As time continued, FBP became violent. The Future Academy School was experiencing a great level of gang activity, with many students being transferred or expelled. In order to join, a member needed to take a beating from the gang, otherwise known as an initiation. Anyone who would run away from the altercation would be known as a marked man and would now be potentially subjected to an even more harmful beating if caught. The FBP, like previous gangs mentioned, sold drugs, fought other gangs for turf control, and would participate in other acts of violence. The FBP would fade out of the gang world in the early 90s, due to many members dying and many of the remaining members being arrested. From the years of 1997 to 2000, Buffalo had an average of 40 homicides a year. While this may be a high number, it was still much better than the previous homicide rate in Buffalo during the first half of the 90s, which hit an all-time high of 92 in 1994. These more moderately peaceful times in Buffalo, however, would soon come to an end, with the Bloods and Crips now making their presence into the city. The recruiters for the Bloods and Crips came from the Bronx area rather than Los Angeles itself, which is the home of these gangs. Signs of new gang activity had become quite apparent by 2001, where the year had over 66 homicides, many of which were rival gangs once again fighting for drug trafficking control. In the early 2000s, it was reported by Elsie Fisher, the principal of Buffalo's alternative school, that Crips and Bloods were now using the school as a means of recruitment. Similar reports also began to arise from other high schools within Buffalo. Buffalo geographically has a huge incentive for drug control, as it is very close to both New York City and Canada. On November 26, 2003, New York Senator Charles Schumer issued a press release that Buffalo was in the middle of an illegal drug pipeline. The issue became so out of hand that local law enforcement wasn't enough to combat the problem. The federal government now needed to get involved as well. Schumer requested in his press release that Buffalo become designated by the U.S. Office of National Drug Control Policy as a high-intensity drug trafficking area. With this designation, it allowed Buffalo to be eligible for millions in federal aid to help local law enforcement. Senator Schumer was successful in his request, and as a result, has been assisted by federal authorities and federal income.